Okay, we're gonna get started here with our lunchtime panel session with our speakers from this morning and from last night. So, if you all could just continue to enjoy your lunch, and we're gonna go in and start to talk about a little bit about what evangelism looks like in our culture today. So, I'm just gonna open up with an opening question that I've gotten a theme from all three of your talks to some extent, and they've just been fantastic and blessed me. Augustine came up with this, and I think you may have been one of the people who first shared this with me. This notion of sin as being homo incurvatus in se, right? So which literally means man curved in, turned in on himself, and that's always helped my thinking in terms of incredibly recently about what is the depth of our sin problem? And it is this inner curved in on ourselves. And to some extent that can happen in the church too. The church can become a reflection of that curved in on ourselves. And I just wondered if you could share a little bit about how, I think you've already given us a lot of information about, or a lot of great, insights on this. But, how do we as a church get over that sort of curved in on ourselves problem, if you will? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. I've stumped them. I didn't think that was possible with these brains, but no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. Am I on here?
Turn it on.
I'll jump on this and just acknowledge that I'd really love to have the right answer to this question. It would make an impact on our church, but it's certainly something that I try to be mindful of, like this idea that Paul talks about the problem of the flesh. And sometimes we hear Paul's language of flesh and think our physical bodies. And yet what Paul really is getting at there, one New Testament scholar describes it as the outlook oriented toward the self. And so this is the fundamental human problem, that we're turned in on ourselves. Homo incurvatus in se. And then we also find ourselves in a cultural environment that just really reinforces that tendency to be turned in upon ourselves. And so part of it, I think for us as a church is just like, let's talk about that. Let's name that. Let's understand the reality of that as the fundamental human problem. Because I think sometimes we have conceptions of sin that are sort of too thin, too shallow. And we actually need a more robust understanding of the human sin problem in order to understand, okay, how does that then call us to turn out from ourselves? The whole process of our spiritual formation is the process of turning outward from ourselves towards God and other people. And so the answer is much more than just talking about it, than just teaching about it. And yet it does have to begin there, that we have an understanding of what is our problem.
We were just having a conversation in my church about cutting back on some of our programming for a similar reason of just like, if we are giving people 4 opportunities a week to be in the church building, and then we say, oh, and on top of that, you should be going out into the community and you should be meeting people and you should be volunteering with other organizations. It's asking so much of people. And it's hard to strike that balance between we need that internal spiritual formation work in community, but we also need to know when we're just like navel gazing and obsessed with ourselves. And so for us, part of it was making some intentional decisions about programming, of going like, we're not going to have 4 nights a week with an opportunity to be together. We might have some of those now be in a coffee shop, or we serve together with an organization that we're partnering with. That's part of our actual neighborhood. And part of the desire to keep some of it in the neighborhood, we partner with global missions organizations as well, but part of the desire for some of it to be located literally at the corner, we talk all the time about the corner of the 2 streets that we're on, is to say, well, maybe if you're partnering with people in those neighborhood organizations, you're also just making friends. Like, you're just meeting people who are in the neighborhood. One of the teenagers at my church just said to me the other day, I thought this was so beautiful, she was even thinking this way. She was like, I know a lot of organizations in our neighborhood, but I don't know a lot of people in our neighborhood. And I was like, wow, I love that you're going like, I want to show up to the service day we do. There's a ministry that works with adults with disabilities and without disabilities. And I love that you want to show up and serve with them, but you also recognize that like the custodial staff that works at that building are all local to our area, and you've never had a conversation with any individual person. You've just done it through the program. So I think that's part of it, of the like getting outside of the internal kind of focus of ourselves, of our churches, is just sometimes people need the push of like it's a church-run partnership, but trying to find ways to say like we're not going to fill up your schedule with just church things. We're going to give you opportunities and help you know what's out there in the neighborhood to be involved in.
I think all that is fantastically helpful. I think one of the challenges that we've had in this period of doing church in my lifetime is, in an effort to find clarity, we've broken things down and separated them. And so we generally would go off and we'll do church stuff in church places. We'll teach about spiritual formation. We'll make sure we're forming ourselves in ways that are orthodox and correct and helpful. And then we'll go off and do mission stuff in other places. That could be local, that could be. And I think the most catalytic experiences that I've had have joined those two things together. It's a missional experience that is consciously formational at the same time. And I find that so, so helpful. So when we go out into the community to do these things, are we bringing with us a sense of how do we experience Jesus in the midst of this? And then how do we spend a little bit of time debriefing how we have experienced Jesus in the midst of this, and pay attention to those formative questions in the midst of mission?
Okay, thank you. That's awesome. I want to move a little bit to sort of our postmodern culture, or some would say our post-postmodern culture, or maybe it's post-postmodern. I don't know. However many modern cultures we need to be moving on from. But, you know, in your experiences and in your ministries, how do you address the sort of the normative narrative of this culture right now, where we talk a lot about there's no absolute truth and that sort of thing, especially in the context of coming out of this of modernity and the idea that we just need to prove God to people, right? We're now in this context where we're still trying to prove God to people who maybe already accept that God may be there, but they just don't accept the God of the Bible. How would you go about, a conversation with somebody in that context?
One thing along the lines of what I was saying this morning about curiosity is asking a bunch of questions about what they even think about the world. A pastor friend of mine, Glenn Packiam, was telling me the other day, I've never thought about this before, that on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus is walking with a couple disciples and they don't recognize him, and he's asking them about what's going on, and they're like, have you not been paying attention to what's happening in Jerusalem? His response to them is, well, what's been happening in Jerusalem? And then listens to them on the walk about what they think has been happening in Jerusalem. And it's only after that he explains the scriptures to them, and their hearts are burning within them, and they realize who he is. And I think that's such if that's what Jesus did, that's a very wise posture. Jesus knew what had happened in Jerusalem. He did not need to ask them. But he was asking, what's the story you're telling about what happened? What parts are relevant to you? How would you narrate what's going on? And I think being in conversation with people and starting with, instead of the assumption of you probably believe all truth is relative, or you probably believe in spirituality and crystals and horoscopes, but you don't believe in the God. Ask some questions and just say what seems relevant and important to you. I am increasingly, as I'm in conversations with undergrad students at Duke, shocked at some of the things they say, because I have assumptions about what young people, even younger than me, like college students, think that end up totally not being true. I mean, not only are some of them, I'm seeing this happen at Duke all the time, there's tons of churches in the area, and they tend to be drawn to the kind of ones that I would think were sort of old-fashioned or weird, or kind of old-school evangelicalism, and they are really attracted to communities where people actually believe something. and that's surprising to me. Or just in my own church, we have been having all these conversations about sexuality, and I was in a room the other day with 5 people, 2 of whom are in their 20s, 2 in their 60s. And we're having a conversation about sexuality. The assumption from most people, the 2 people in their 20s who did not grow up in the church will have the most progressive views on sexuality. The 2 people in their 60s that grew up in the church will have the most conservative. It was the opposite. It was completely flipped. The 2 people in their 60s had grown up in the church, but it hadn't been that important to a lot of their lives. And so as the culture changed around sexuality, they kind of changed their minds about it. The 2 people in their 20s that did not grow up in the church, when they decided to show up to a church, that was already a countercultural thing to do. And one of them even said to me something along the lines of I thought we were staking our lives on a different ethic than the world. I assumed I would have to give up some things I thought I believed about sexuality. So I just say that to say, like, I think one way we approach this that's honoring of people, but also helps us know what we even should be saying, is just asking some questions and getting started. Because I think especially the, Gen Z, even younger generation right now, they believe things that we're confused by. Like, they believe things that do not fit the stereotypes that we have about young people and religion.
That's so good. I think that's so important that we just approach with that curious posture, asking questions. You made reference to taking the evangelism class that I taught years ago, and Caitlin was part of this as well. That when I inherited that class, part of it was your grade is contingent on kind of getting 5 different people into a corner and getting through your gospel presentation, right? And you've got to get the full good news out to them, and your grade depends on it. And I just felt really uncomfortable with that, not because I didn't want people sharing the gospel, but it actually made those people with whom they were sharing the gospel sort of an object in this, right? You're here to hear this presentation for the sake of my grade. And so we switched it and said, lead with questions. And if those questions open up the opportunity for you to share the gospel, beautiful. But start with questions, and your grade is going to be contingent on asking good questions and listening. I'll never forget debriefing that exercise. One of my students was sharing and got tears in his eyes because he said, I've been trying to share my faith with my dad for 15 years. And he said, and I never just stopped to say, Dad, what do you believe? And he said, by starting with the question, it opened up the best spiritual conversation that they'd ever had in all these years of trying to engage about the gospel. So I just think that curious approach that leads with questions, it's part of what we see modeled in Jesus. The other thing that I thought of when you asked the question, Alec, is just we talk a lot at IBC about the truth and beauty of the gospel. The truth and beauty of the gospel. And I think when you talk about postmodern and post-postmodern, right, it used to be the case more people were really wrestling through the question of, is this true? And I can't help but think that more and more people are wrestling today with, is this good, right? Is this beautiful? And so are we presenting a beautiful gospel? Are we living a beautiful gospel? Are we showing not just its truth, but also this is really good news?
That's also good. I'm not going to say anything.
And I think that's part of the beauty, though, of what you guys are doing. I mean, that 500 million people, that is good news for the world. Yeah.
And we did this panel, I think it was a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, the idea of, is it beautiful? What is beautiful? Being so integral to the thinking of Gen Z and so forth. They're not asking the question, what is true, but what is beautiful? With that in mind, and maybe, how do you go about making the gospel beautiful when you're engaging in your ministries?
I think there is a vital discipline of paying attention to what is going on around you. I think we, in our daily lives, have a tendency to run right past the work that God is doing, not notice it and not celebrate it, and therefore glorify the God who is the doer of it. And so I think even for us at IJM, this discipline of praying together every day is a discipline of noticing. What do we need to ask help for? What weight am I carrying that's not appropriate for me to carry, that actually is God's responsibility? So let's throw that off together and say, we're going to ask God for what we need in this area. But we are also, in a disciplined way, going to notice and celebrate the ways that we've seen God show up. That might be in granting a visa that seemed impossible to get for employee to move from country X to country Y. That may be a generous gift that was given by someone who's invested in our ministry. That may be a court case that was won. That may be a rescue operation. But I think until I arrived at IJM 17 years ago, I didn't have a regular discipline of noticing. So now I have this storehouse of stories of the goodness of God that are available to me to tell to my children, to tell to people I meet who are interested in what I what I've been doing with my life. And I think those things are things that tap into people's inherent desire to see beauty and meaning in life. I think if we, yeah, so I think it's incumbent upon me to notice that beauty and to internalize it and then be able to share it.
Yeah, I think about the idea of part of our evangelistic task today. I think for a long time, it's kind of assumed people, particularly in our North American context, kind of understood, and they just needed sort of that bullet point summary. God loves you and has a plan for you, and we had just the bullet point summary. And so the evangelistic task was learn the bullet point summary so that you can present that to people. And I'm not against bullet point summaries, but Jim, what you're talking about here is our becoming adept at telling stories of the aliveness of God in our lives. And, right, so that requires us to actually cultivate that awareness of how is God showing up as alive in my life? And then how can I get better at telling stories, sharing with my neighbors, sharing with people in my church community the way in which God is alive. And so we're not so much making the gospel beautiful as pointing out the beauty that's there.
Along those same lines, it reminds me of some of the model that made sense in a different era, maybe in the middle of the 20th century when people were super optimistic about human nature and we can do all these amazing things. It made sense to say, well, the first thing you got to convince someone of is that they're sinful and they're bad and the world is broken. And it was just a couple months ago, I was at this event at Duke with tons of people that were not Christians, really kind of inter-campus ministry with like the campus Democrats, it was like all these different people. And they know the world is bad. Like they know the world is broken. They know there's something wrong in them and they know it and they're exhausted. And the idea that someone would come along and because they were given a pre-written formula that they can't deviate from would say, you are sinful and the world is broken. And they're like, I know, and I'm tired of hearing that. And I actually think, going back to what you were saying, Alec, about like, are we postmodern, are we post-postmodern? There are some theorists now saying we are post-postmodern, and some of the vibe of that is actually this return to like a naivete or a kind of optimism or a sincerity. And the stereotype about college students is that like they're cynical and they might be really caring about certain activistic things, but like, they're looking for authenticity. They're not looking for your like happy clappy, whatever. They're looking for some happy clappy right now, I think. Like they really are interested in someone who's coming in and saying like, I so sincerely believe that Christ will return to make all things new and this is not the end of the story. I think that used to just almost always read as naive or pious. And a lot of the time now I'm seeing it just be like, I've been waiting for something like that. I didn't need to hear the first part. I needed to hear there is something better than just the world that I'm experiencing. I just had someone at Duke recently tell me she had been looking at a bunch of churches, and a bunch of them, because she was a political science student at Duke, kept talking to her about all the activism they were doing. And she was like, I love that, and I think that's part of Christianity. But also, she had not yet decided yet if she was going to get baptized, if she was going to be, she was trying to discern it. And she was like, you doing a lot of activism tells me something, and I care about that. But she had this story of going to a church in our area and asking, like, I'm really trying to figure out if Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Do you think he did or not? And they were sort of like, we don't know how important that is. And she was like, I'm going to stake my life on this. Like, if I'm going to do that, I need to know that you believe it's true. And I think there were some churches in our area that were just like, if we kind of back away from the supernatural stuff, we'll get some more people in the door. And she was like, I want to know that you believe something wild. Like, I want to know you believe something that will change my whole life. And she found a church that she so believed they believed that, and she got baptized.
I can almost relate with that. I had an experience in church. I wasn't a believer yet. I was just starting to go, where they were reading the Apostles' Creed. They recited and I'm reading these words, and I'm like going, whoa, this is some serious stuff. And everybody was sort of rotely reading it, and I was like, do they believe what they're reading here? Do they know it? And it sort of was like so I appreciate what you're saying. You touched on authenticity. In some of my dissertation work, one of the pastors I interviewed said, authenticity is a big thing right now. It's critical. I think for the next generation, for your generation and the generations to come, it's more of a we want to know you're real, right? But he also said, I strive to be authentic, but more than that, I strive to be vulnerable. That vulnerability is, is the way that he's, what he emphasizes when he's talking about the next generation. Can you share a little bit about, like, I mean, it's hard. It's hard for us to be vulnerable. I mean, especially for guys. I mean, it's like, but what role can that play in sort of bridging the gap between people and the gospel?
I think my kids now are 30, 27, and 25. And to share somewhat vulnerably, only one of them is following Jesus. There is an inherent lack of authenticity radar in people that age. So if you want to assassinate your own character in the presence of someone who is 30 or younger, then simply don't be authentic, and they will never listen to another thing that you say. You've ruined it for the next, until you become authentically present to them. And so I think it, again, becomes incumbent upon us, which is why I'm so grateful for all of the living the gospel conversation that we're having this weekend. Absolutely incumbent upon us to be authentically connected to Jesus, right? And that doesn't happen by merely, showing up at church, right? We have to cultivate a life that keeps us deeply and authentically connected to Jesus in ways where we can actually talk about what that means and what that looks like. Right, the spiritual disciplines, we've gotten used to being taught like the spiritual disciplines are themselves the thing. I need to talk about how much I pray, but no, these things are the gateway through which I reach a sense of my own belovedness in the presence of God, the gateway to the place where I find my purpose in this on this planet. And those are the things that I think make the deepest connection to my daughter, who is so deeply looking for some of these things and feels like she feels her own tension about not having found those yet. So I strive to be deeply authentically present with her whenever I possibly can.
Do you all have any thoughts?
Early on when I made the transition from being full-time in the classroom and a part-time pastor to becoming now full-time pastor and was just teaching one class a semester, I had a moment in the middle of class of realization, kind of in real time processing, talking about vulnerability with this class, and made the observation that I think that Dr. Jones is actually better at vulnerability than Pastor Barry. And it was the first time that I was sort of naming just the fact that I operate differently in this space than I do in that one. And the student then came back and said, well, why do you think that is? And I had a hard time getting there. I thought, well, maybe it's size and scope. Like we're here together over time, building a relationship, and that's a lot more people. And yet, the more I really kind of explored that, it was I really need these people to believe that I'm competent. And so I had to project an image of competence. And something about the recognition that I felt that pressure to project an image is part of what invited me into a deeper place of vulnerability, of like recognizing the dynamics of what's happening in my heart. Why am I struggling to be vulnerable in this space? Oh, because I really want them to believe I'm competent. And in fact, what they really need is what I've learned to give to my students. I've learned to sort of let that go and actually be open in ways that have invited life-giving kinds of interactions and conversations. And that's the gift that I need to learn to be able to give to my congregation, even though it comes with a certain kind of, vulnerability. Right? It's terrifying sometimes.
We would joke all the time. I took so many of your classes and the TA'd for a long time for Dr. Jones, and I used to give you a lot of grief for crying in class, like all the time. But
and then you made me cry this morning.
And then,
so.
yeah, well, but it is true that like it's connected to this thing of like, do you really believe this? In that, especially in an academic environment, especially now that I'm at Duke and not a ton of my faculty have been pastors, people don't always really believe it. You're not really sure what they believe. And I've always said this about my parents, that like, I am still a Christian today in part because Doug and Debbie Shess, like, we have fought about things. They have changed their minds about things. I have changed my mind about things. I never once the entire time I grew up ever doubted that they really believed that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and that it changed their whole lives. And even as I questioned some specific beliefs they had, I never questioned that it was sincere for them. Like, it was really real. And the same was true of you in seminary. Like, what was so attractive to me about learning theology was like, oh, you can do it with your whole heart. Like, you can really believe this and it makes a difference. And sparking that in someone, like that desire, is so different than just like, here are books to read, I say that because I appreciate that from you, but also just because I think sometimes parents, particularly now that I do a podcast about kids and theology, will tell me all the time, like, I squash questions my kids have because I'm so scared I don't know the answer. And if they ask something that's either a really big question or gets at something I'm really wrestling with, like, that'll undo me. And it's like, having a parent that says, like, I don't know, that's so hard, or like cries because of the beauty of something, or cries because they're like, I don't know why God would let that happen. I don't know what's going on. That long term, I think, whether that's a parent or a Sunday school teacher or a pastor, like, that sets people up to go, like, you're really in this with me. You are not just projecting the competence. For parents as well, like, you're not just projecting that you have the answers. You're saying, like, I'm trying to figure this out with you too.
And I think in our churches, we have to work really hard. It's part of the burden that I carry as a pastor, but it's something that all of us have a part to play in, of creating cultures of authenticity and vulnerability. Because, right, if the culture doesn't allow for that, then everybody's going to walk around kind of doing that work of projecting an image. And it's easy for us in the church to live that way. I grew up in churches where everybody kind of had to look the same, talk the same, say the same things, kind of project an image that they have it all together. And we have to work hard to create a culture of grace that actually allows people to really be themselves. And so as a pastor, that's a big part of the burden that I feel like I bear with our community.
Are there anything in particular that you? Oh, sorry. That you do to? Because I think you're really hitting on something there. The space to be vulnerable in the church. Is there any?
I mean, part of it is trying to tell on myself at every opportunity that I can, not in a way that's where I'm now using this collective gathering as a kind of my therapy session where I'm just sort of putting it all out there. And yet, when there are those opportunities for me to tell a story that doesn't make me the hero, that doesn't put me in the best light, but that is really that opportunity for me to just say, here's me, right? We're like I have, throughout my Christian life, struggled with doubt. And honestly, for a long time, I felt like I could never be a pastor because you can't struggle with doubt the way that I do and be a pastor. So somehow I thought I could become a theologian. And yet what I've come to discover is one of the greatest gifts that I have to give to my congregation is to share honestly about my doubt. Because then they go, you too? You who spent all this time studying theology, you who spent all this time teaching in the seminary, you who are my pastor, who gets up and passionately preaches the scriptures, still struggle with some of these questions, you too? And so just looking for those opportunities of when I can share from that place of vulnerability helps create that then throughout the culture of our church, I think.
I think that's beautiful and so absolutely necessary and so seldom done, right? And I think that's one of the keys, this kind of honest emotional transparency that isn't codependent or unhealthy, but is just honest. I think another key for me, another secret here has been the concept of risk. Have I eliminated all meaningful risk from my life? Because sometimes, in certain periods of my discipleship, it felt like that was what I was supposed to do. It was what I was supposed to do as a Christian. It was what I was supposed to do as a parent, is just sort of eliminate risk. That was my job. And so I've come over the last 30 years or so to think, I actually need to be in places where I am risking, because that is going to pull me into this place of vulnerability. That's what's going to actually test my faith. Because faith is actually made up of two things. If you look up the definitions of faith, this is a non-academic version of this. If you look up definitions of faith in dictionaries, you get two separate concepts. You get the concept of belief, is what I'm intellectually assenting to true, but you also get the concept of trust, right? So faith is belief plus trust. Church, very, very good at teaching belief, not so good at teaching trust. The way we bring people into trust is often through risk. Can you take an appropriate risk where you will learn to trust that God is good? And we do this in relationship with one another all the time, right? We take emotional risks in relationships where intimacy develops. So how are we doing that in our faith? What choices will I make this year that will bring me to places where I must trust in the goodness of God?
Thank you. That's awesome. That's fantastic. We got about a few minutes left here before we break out for our breakouts. And I want to ask one other question of you. I think of Calvin, the Institutes of Religion, right? Starts with true wisdom, wisdom that is true is knowledge of God and knowledge of man. And we spend a lot of time knowing, studying God, right? And I think what Pastor Charles brought out in the earlier discussion was the sort of the mind and the heart. And I think on our side of the pond, we're a little bit more ground in the mind. But one of the things that came out in some of my other work was just how a profound level of lack of self-awareness can really affect how you're, sharing the gospel. And so I'd love to hear from you. How do you go about in your, daily lives, in your spiritual formation? And I know, Jim, you gave us some awesome stuff last night about that. How do you cultivate that sense of self-awareness that I think is critical to effectively, communicating the gospel?
My first thought was like, you should have opinions on the internet because you'll get everyone's opinion back at you of what you. I really think it has been a new experience for me in just the last few years. I've been in church my whole life, and I've loved the church my whole life, and I've had negative experiences in the church, and I've had really beautiful experiences in the church. But in just the last few years, I made a series of pretty intentional choices to really root myself in the church that I'm in, to put myself under accountability of some people, in part because I do a lot of public work, and I was like, I can't just listen to the internet trolls to tell me if I'm doing a good job or not. I really need people in my life. And I've been so surprised at how much I need other people to tell me about myself. There's so much that I don't know apart from that reflection back, but also how much I learned, just even before they've said anything, by just being the risk of relationship exposes things about me that I didn't know were there. And it goes back to what I was saying this morning of just and Barry and I were talking about this earlier, I'm leaving the church that I'm at now because I'm moving away, and I'm so heartbroken, and I keep having people say oh, you'll find another church, it's fine. And it reveals to me oh, we're not deeply belonging to each other. If it feels like I can just up and leave and it's not a big deal, I have not been deeply obligated to these people. And that's not just a loss for that community, but it's I won't know myself very well when I'm just alone. The internet will tell me what my identity is. I will be shaped and formed by not real embodied people, and I will lose all sense of where I exist in the place and time that I'm at and who I am. And opening yourself up to that risk of someone saying hey, after you've been watching that news source, you're kind of a real jerk. Or hey, on these kinds of days, you have this tendency to talk in this way that's unhelpful. I can't do that without the people who I have opened myself up to, who can say those kinds of things to me. And the church is an opportunity that we're not in clubs anymore. Most people do not have the kind of community they need to tell that. If the church could be that for each other, like I said before, I think initially that's really painful. It's scary. It's risk. I think increasingly people are actually looking for that. They're really sick of the weight of creating their own identity all by themselves. They're looking for people to be involved in it too.
One of the things I love about hearing the practice that Jim talked about at IJM, the beginning that day with that 30 minutes of silence, that silence is necessary for us to really cultivate a deep sense of self-awareness. We have to really examine. I mean, for me, part of it is just this constant, like, what is really going on here, right? Why did this create that reaction for me? What's really going on here? And I think the only way we can really develop that is to truly face ourselves, to truly face God, and to truly face ourselves before God. And we do that in the practice of silence. So that's become increasingly an important practice for me. And it's so interesting to note, both within the Christian spiritual tradition and then all this stuff that I'm reading from leadership literature, both of them point to how important self-awareness is for deep soul work and for effective leadership. And yet, the fact is, one study that I came across recently said, 95 people say that self-awareness is really important, but only 10 or 15% of people actually meet their criteria for self-awareness. So we have to continue to just cultivate that introspection that says, what's really going on here?
All right. Well, thank you all so much. That was awesome. This has just been a great morning and a great night last night. The messages have been powerful. And so I just want to, can we just give our speakers a round of applause here?